So after a lot of spin-offs and TV shows, it was at that time 3D was starting to hit video games ever since the success of Super Mario 64, so Sega thought it was time to transfer the Hedgehog into 3D. Originally, Sonic's first 3D was intended to be called Sonic Extreme, and it was supposed to be released for the Sega Saturn, but for some reason Sega was later unimpressed with the results and decided to pan the game for good. Then after many unsuccessful games, the Sega Saturn was short-lived. So the idea was changed, and instead Sega developed another game as a launch title for their next console, the Dreamcast, which would become Sonic's full debut in the realm of 3D, Sonic Adventure. Now the story and gameplay in this game is split up into 6 stories, with all of which have different characters with their own style of gameplay. For Sonic's story, Sonic confronts a water creature called Chaos, who he manages to defeat but gets away easily. Later, Sonic meets up with Tails, who shows him one of the 7 Chaos Emeralds, which later gets stolen by Dr. Robotnik, who is now named Dr. Eggman this time. Now Sonic and Tails have to get the 7 Chaos Emeralds before Eggman uses them to increase Chaos's power. Sonic's gameplay still has the same supersonic speed we all remember from the Genesis games, but it's now fully refreshed in fully 3D levels. However, the biggest addition in this game is the hub worlds, which are called adventure fields. With this new addition, you can freely explore to progress through the character's story, as well as finding some secrets and hidden items. Along the way, you'll also obtain power-ups to help advance more through the game. For Sonic, one of his power-ups are the light speed shoes, which allows him to run across paths of ring. There are also small sub-games that the characters can take part in, like snowboarding and pinball. For Sonic's gameplay, I have to say they definitely nailed it perfectly, as it still keeps the platforming and speed from before, but gives us a more refreshing features and levels. For Tails' story, it's pretty much just like Sonic's, where Tails just aids Sonic throughout the story to help him get the 7 Chaos Emeralds. However, as the story progresses, Tails will develop from a trusty sidekick into an independent hero, which probably makes this my favourite story of the 6. His gameplay is also just like Sonic's, except these stages will have Tails to race against Sonic, and he has to get to the goal before Sonic does. This game also allows us to endear more on Tails' flying abilities, where you can fly for a short period of time, which makes use of this gameplay. As you progress, Tails can obtain a power-up, which will give him his own attack where he can spin his tails around at enemies. All this adds up to make Tails' gameplay definitely enjoyable for what it is. And then we have Knuckles, whose story starts out with him guarding the Master Emerald, but then also confronts Chaos after being free from the Master Emerald by Eggman. After trying to defeat Chaos, Knuckles notices that the Master Emerald has been shattered, therefore forcing him to find all of the pieces of the emerald. Along the way, he has flashbacks of his ancestors, one in particular named Typhel, who appears as a help for all the characters in the game. Knuckles' gameplay differs a lot from Sonic and Tails, as his levels instead consist of non-linear levels, where Knuckles needs to find 3 pieces of the Master Emerald, which are hidden in these levels. Knuckles has with him a sort of radar, which helps him tell how close he is to getting a piece. Throughout the game, Knuckles will obtain a new power-up called the Digger Gloves, which helps him dig for hidden items and pieces of the emerald. I have to say, the levels in Knuckles' story are extremely easy. That's not to say that they're bad, but I managed to complete this story the fastest because of how simple it was to find these pieces. Then we have Amy Rose. Now we all know that in Sonic CD she was just portrayed as a damsel in distress. However, in this game she's now portrayed as a normal young girl who has a huge obsession with Sonic. And here she finds a bird seeking for help, and she decides to become its protection. She would later join Sonic on his adventure, but ends up getting captured by one of Eggman's robots named Zero and is imprisoned. However, another robot known as Gamma releases her, and she continues her adventure to find Sonic. For Amy's gameplay, whilst it isn't terrible, it isn't that much fun either. Although I did like the platforming in her levels, for the most part she is typically slow, and some of the mini-games involving her can be really frustrating at times. Nonetheless, her gameplay is okay if unspectacular. And now we have new characters, one of which is Big the Cat, a giant purple cat who has a frog friend named Froggy. His story involves his pet frog running off after being attacked by Chaos, and so Big has to find Froggy. Yeah, this is definitely the weakest story in the entire game. As goes for Big's gameplay, I'm pretty sure everybody who has played through the whole game has been angered by the frustration of trying to fish for Froggy in these levels. And yes, I will agree with myself that these levels are ball-busting hard, that it makes this also my least favourite of the bunch, so there really isn't much to say about it since a lot of people know how annoying these levels are. And finally, the sixth character in the game is E102 Gamma, who I mentioned earlier in Amy's story. His story starts out after being created by Eggman, and is trained to be his new robot. However, after freeing Amy from prison, he develops a conscience and decides to turn against Eggman and destroy his other robots to free the other animals. All this makes Gamma possibly the most developed character in the entire game. And spoiler alert, the scene where he dies near the end of his story has been considered one of the most tear-jerking scenes in the Sonic series. For Gamma's gameplay, it's the same point A to point B routine, but instead involves shooting through obstacles and fighting one of Eggman's robots near the end to release in animals. Even though these levels can get a little tiring, they still make up for a little enjoyable shooting experience and are definitely a breath of fresh air from the big levels. Now that all of the gameplay of each character is covered, let's talk about the other stuff. Like for the bonus, this game introduces the Chow Garden, where you can adopt and raise creatures called chows and treat them like pets. As for the music of the game, this was the first Sonic game to have songs vocalized by the rock band Crush 40, and each and every one of their songs are quite catchy and memorable amongst many Sonic fans, meaning that they would later compose more songs for future Sonic games. And the level themes were also amazing and they add to the atmosphere of the game. Overall, you could call this the Super Mario 64 of the Sonic franchise, as it still brings Sonic greatness to the table, but still adds new, refreshing things that keeps it from being too similar. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the game was a massive hit, getting overwhelmingly positive reviews from critics, which then led to a Gamecube remake retitled Sonic Adventure DX Director's Cut, and a port to the PS3 and Xbox 360. And so Sega would continue this success with the sequel, Sonic Adventure 2. The story has Dr. Eggman infiltrating a secret GUN facility in search of a secret weapon created by his grandfather. That secret weapon turns out to be who would become one of the most hyped Sonic characters, Shadow the Hedgehog, who claims himself as the ultimate life form. After meeting Eggman, Shadow shows him a super weapon known as the Eclipse Cannon, which can only be used to destroy a planet if all 7 Chaos Emeralds are installed. So Eggman and Shadow decide to go after the Chaos Emeralds again with the assist of another new character, Rouge the Bat. After being framed by Shadow by the GUN military, Sonic and his friends must prevent Eggman, Shadow and Rouge from getting the 7 Chaos Emeralds. The game has 2 story choices to choose from, Hero and Dark, and each story has 3 different types of gameplay. The first type of gameplay are the running speedy stages played by both Sonic and Shadow, which are just like the ones in the original, but here they offer more platforming, high-speed running, riding on rails, and it's the typical point A to point B routine. Once you reach the goal, you are given score results on how good you did in the level. The second type of gameplay is the shooting stages played by both Tails and Eggman. These levels consist of getting to the goal, but this time shooting down enemies and switches to progress, which feels similar to Gamma's gameplay from before, and instead of dying by having no rings, you are instead giving a health bar. And they are pretty enjoyable as before, though I would still prefer that they kept Tails' flying abilities from the original. And the final type of gameplay are the treasure hunting stages, played by both Knuckles and Rouge. They are just like before, but are even bigger and involve more puzzle solving. I wouldn't say these levels are terrible, but it would have been better to cut down the size a bit and make the puzzles less complex. And that's pretty much the adventure mode. Other new modes are a multiplayer feature, which involves racing and treasure hunting just like in the single player. That and the Chow Garden has returned and heavily improved, adding new types of gardens like Hero Garden and Dark Garden, and even mini-games like Chow Races and Chow Karate. The character models also have been improved, and it brought back Crush 40 doing the vocal songs for the themes of the characters and the levels. Overall, this was definitely an addicting sequel to an already outstanding 3D platforming game, and so the game was definitely just as successful, and just like the original, it got a Gamecube remake entitled Sonic Adventure 2 Battle. 2 years later, Sega released a new and slightly different 3D Sonic game, Sonic Heroes, where it added a new gimmick which was teamwork, having 3 characters in one team with 3 different abilities. The speed, the fastest one of the bunch, the flying, who helps the team reach higher places, and the power, who is the strongest one. And one final ability is Team Blast, when by increasing a bar by collecting rings or defeating enemies, the team can perform a more powerful action to destroy stronger enemies and bosses. The teams are Team Sonic, bonded with Sonic, Tails and Knuckles, who have the speed and fast-paced levels, Team Dark, bonded with Shadow, Rouge and new character Omega, who have the difficult and more action-packed levels, Team Rose, bonded with Amy, Cream and Big, whose levels are shorter and more aimed at beginning gamers, and Team Chaotix, bonded with Espio, Charmy and Vector, whose levels are more mission-based. The game is also focused more on the Genesis games this time rather than the adventure games, with similar levels that have a boss with Dr. Eggman at the end. However, Sonic Heroes still manages to keep the fast-paced action that was included in the adventure games as well. They also brought back the bonus stages as well, which consist of racing to get to the Chaos Emerald before reaching the end. The music in this game was also very reminiscent to the Genesis games, and still giving great atmosphere to the levels. When the game was released, however, it got less than what the adventure games got. It still got positive reviews, but there were more mixed reviews this time. If you've seen my top 5 games I used to love and now I don't, you will know that I'm not a big fan of this game. I wouldn't call it awful, but what the game suffers from is slippery controls, annoying camera system, mediocre voice acting and repetition. Nonetheless, it was still quite successful, if not as successful as the adventure games. The next year, Sega released a game which would be based on Shadow the Hedgehog's backstory and made for those who are big fans of the character, simply called Shadow the Hedgehog. It's about Shadow suffering from amnesia after his incident in Sonic Adventure 2, where he is trying to remember his past and how he was created. He is then met up with a mysterious demon figure, Black Doom, whose army of black demons is causing destruction upon a city called Westopolis. Black Doom tells Shadow that he can tell his past if Shadow works for him. Shadow instead wanders into the city to find the answers himself, and would later meet up with other Sonic characters asking for his help. For this game, Sega dropped the formula from the previous games of going from point A to point B, and instead gave us a more action-packed experience. The game's main feature is the ability to switch between either good, neutral or dark. If you take the good side, you'll have to take out a number of black demons or find a specific character or item. If you take the neutral side, you'll just simply run towards the goal like before. And if you take the bad side, you'll be given a number of tasks to do that will involve taking out gun soldiers or destroying ships. The new gameplay features for Shadow are now elements from a third-person shooter, so you'll get to use different types of weapons to help you with taking out enemies or destroying targets. You also get to drive several types of vehicles, most of which are really pointless, but some are required to progress through the levels. Just like in Sonic Heroes with the Team Blast, Shadow has 2 types of chaos powers to use. If you build up the hero meter, you can perform chaos control, which helps you progress faster through the levels, and if you build up the dark meter, you can perform chaos blast, which destroys everything in your path. There are a total of 10 endings to get, and all of them depend on which side and route you take. And so that was basically the gameplay for Shadow. They also included a multiplayer feature, which I have to say sucks really bad because it's really dull and sometimes lags the frame rate. When the game was released, it did pretty well in the sales, managing to sell over 1 million copies, but with the critics, oh boy, it was ugly. They mostly gave the game negative reviews because it deals with more adult tone, like weapons, shooting, driving, swearing, and a dark toned story for a Sonic game. That and the controls and voice acting were also heavily criticised. However, despite hatred from critics and Sonic fags, fans of the character Shadow still greatly enjoyed it. For me, it's a mixed bag. I do like the concept of switching sides and the game's variety of levels, but what dumbed it down for me was the tad slippery controls, poor aiming system for the weapons, repetitive missions, the voice acting was even more poor than Sonic Heroes with a few exceptions, and the story seemed too bland for me. So that's pretty much all I have to say about the Dreamcast era. Hope you all enjoyed it, and stay tuned for the final part where I talk about the modern era.